Emotional physics, psychematics, emotional physics, psychematics. It has been interesting to find that there are some fascinating connections between physics and emotions and behavior. And I'm starting to think that a lot of these terms that we use when it comes to our emotions and behavior actually come from physics. They actually come from physics. And to me, it's been so helpful. And I just was talking to Dr. Sohaib a moment ago. I took up like the last 10 minutes of his show, but it was because he was talking about something that really struck me. It was about addiction, and he was on the subject of alcohol. And I've been sober off of alcohol for 2 years now. And I'm also now completely straight edge, meaning if you don't know the term, I don't use any nicotine products, so no vaping, no smoking cigarettes. I don't use marijuana. I don't smoke weed. That is, I don't use any other drugs, and I don't drink alcohol at all. And my only addictions are what I call my 4 M's, which is metaphysics, mathematics, music, and martial arts. Those are what I do from the time I wake up in the morning to the time I go to sleep. These are the things that occupy my life. And this emotional physics, this I call it psychematics. I think I actually at one time had a website called Psychematics where I discussed this. And it comes from the introductory physics term kinematics. And it's one of the first places that I started to see these analogous similarities between physics, human behavior, and emotions. And so the best example I'll give is something I started to talk about yesterday when I spoke of, uh, I talked about a master hypnotist reveals how to escape the rat race. And no matter how I reframe this or title this or name it, it comes around to the same things about human emotions and behavior. And the example I gave, and this is something we can learn from kinematics, but the simplest example is this, is a track, a racetrack, the NASCAR, right? Those cars that go around and around 500 times a 1 mile track. And if you look at it from the start, right, the starting line to the finish line is the same place. You go around a circle, 1 mile, and the start and the finish is the same place. And in kinematics, in beginning physics, they would say that you have traveled a distance of 1 mile or 1 kilometer, if you want to use the metric system, right? But even though you've traveled one unit, I'll stick with miles for right now, right? Even though you've traveled for 1 mile, you still ended up in the same place. So all the fuel, all the energy that the car put out to go around that circle, it's traveled for an entire mile, but it still ended up in the same place, right? And so this, in the relation, how it relates to human emotions and behavior, is that a lot of people say this about their experience of life, is that I feel stuck, I feel trapped, I feel like I'm just marking time, I'm treading water, I'm putting out all this energy, but I'm always in the same place. I can't seem to escape from this situation no matter how hard I work, right? And it's this going around, this putting out this energy to go that mile, but you're ending up back in the same place. So in kinematics, they would talk about that as being, in physics, as being a scalar, meaning it has a magnitude or an amount. It's how much, right? But it's not a vector, right? Because it's not going anywhere away. It's not a displacement, that is, right? You haven't displaced yourself. Whereas if you go, we could look at it to make it another simple example of a mile. We can look at it as if you start at one place and we're going to walk in a square, going a quarter mile each time. So if you start at a certain point, and let's just say you go right for 1 mile, right? And I'm sorry, you go right for a quarter mile, all right? And then and from where you're standing, like say let's use cardinal directions. That'll be better. Say you're facing north, right? And then if you turn to your right you go east for a quarter mile. Then you turn to your left and you go north for a quarter mile. Then you turn to your left again and you're going west for a quarter mile. And then you turn left again and you go south for a quarter mile. That whole mile you traveled, you actually end up back in the same exact place. So in kinematics, it would say that you've traveled a distance of 1 mile, right? Going east a quarter mile, north a quarter mile, west a quarter mile, and south a quarter mile. You ended up back in the same place, provided you've gone in a straight line, right? And so you, even though you put out that energy that got you to travel for 1 mile, you've ended up back in the same place. So there's no displacement. You're in the same place. Whereas if you were to be facing north and you were to travel north for 1 mile, or even turn to your right and travel east for 1 mile, or any direction for that matter, now you have a vector, a direction that you're going for 1 mile, and now you've displaced yourself. You've moved away from your original position 1 mile. And this is the analogy of what it is people are attempting to really accomplish in their lives, is to move from where they are to somewhere else. I'm using physical locations in space and time to demonstrate that, but over and over, these different types of examples can be shown to be relevant to human behavior, and from physics and from science can be shown to be relevant to human behavior. One of my favorite ones is from the first law of motion from Isaac Newton. And it basically says that that an object at rest will stay at rest, and an object in motion will stay in that same motion, right? Unless they're acted upon by an outside force. So unless a force acts on them. So this means that if you're sitting still, you're not going to go anywhere unless you press the gas, right? Or else you get up and start walking. And if you're going in a certain direction, let's say you are going north, right? You're going to keep going that way. Let's say you're in space where there's no friction, there's nothing to stop you, right? No, and you're going to keep going that direction unless you fire your boosters and maybe change your vector, change your direction, right? Change your acceleration into a different direction. So Newton's first law: if you're at rest, you'll stay there, and if you're at a certain trajectory, if you're going in a certain direction, you're going to stay there unless you change that deliberately. And so that's another way how a lot of people feel about their lives as well, is that they're either I feel like I'm just sitting still, I feel like I'm going nowhere, right? Well, because there's no outside force, there's no intervening motivation. That word motivation, right, comes from the word for movement, motor, like we have motor neurons, motors in cars, right? And and so that is one of my favorite ones, and where physics shows also has a relationship to our emotions and behavior. Now, they become useful because they help us to understand things in a couple of different ways. It helps us to show that we can actually apply very similar rules, or make very similar applications to changing our vector, to changing our direction. And for example, we just have to first understand that that's possible and that's what's happening, and that we can do it, right? And we can even look at, for example, one of the most popular of Isaac Newton's laws of motion, which is his third law. Well, actually, maybe in pop science it's the most one, but it's kind of with interchangeable with the second law, which is force equals mass times acceleration. But the third law basically says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? So, like a rocket ship, it blasts out, it explodes fuel, which is blasted out through the nozzles, right, which push against the ground, and then that gives an equal and opposite reaction. The Earth pushes back against the rocket, and that's what gives it its liftoff. And so we can start thinking in terms of that, like how much, in order to get moving from where you are, right, to overcome inertia, right, in that first law, the inertial force of you going in a certain trajectory that you don't want to be going in, or sitting still where you don't want to be, we have to find out how much motivation. See, the motivation is that energy that's needed to move you from where you are to another position. See, the thing is that it's all about overcoming inertia, emotional and behavioral inertia. Just like you have to overcome the inertia of the position that you're in, which deals with your mass, right, and the gravitational field strength, the gravitational constant, right, which can be related to what things are holding you in place. If you're not moving from where you are to where you want to be, it's simply a matter of figuring out and then applying the amount of motivational force to get you to either move from where you are or to change your direction. And that's really what one of the main points here is. It's sometimes we think, oh, nothing's happening, and so we quit. But the problem is not necessarily that you don't have, it's not necessarily that you don't have the right ideas or you don't have the motivation. It's just that there's not enough to overcome where you're in. This relates again to, we talk about Newton's laws of motion, right? Well, there's something called escape velocity, right? Where we have to escape the gravitational force of Earth. You have to get to a certain speed in that rocket ship in order to escape the the and get into microgravity, because you're never really escaping gravity, but you get into microgravity where the force of Earth is not as strong. So the further away you get from the surface of the Earth, the less the effect of gravity is on you. And so a lot of times what we're really looking for is to get the enough motivation to get the escape velocity from where we are, and or to overcome the inertia from the path that we're going on. So for example, even the the International Space Station, right? It's in low Earth orbit. It's constantly falling towards the surface of the Earth, but the speed at which it's going is just enough for it not to crash into the Earth. And so it stays in orbit. It's just constantly falling towards the curvature of the Earth, but it just misses the curvature of the Earth by where it is. So this is what we're really, really looking for, is not necessarily the that to say, to give up and say, oh, I'm not motivated, or that I don't have the right ideas. It's how much energy have you put into it? How much fuel, how much motivation goes into it? And so these are the basic ideas that have been really fascinating to me, to see how much these things in science, particularly physics, relate to human psychology. Yesterday, I think it's Coach Doris, I think her name is. I'm not, I forgive me, I don't recall. She's from Austria. She's a coach here, and she was talking about stress. And as she was talking about stress, another one of these ideas popped into my mind about how closely related these ideas are to physics. And it was the fact that I realized that you could look at the stress that we talk about people have, in which is emotional basically and psychological, and how closely that's related to the ideas of stress in physics. And I was talking about how I read a lot of books, and I have a lot of books with me. And one of the examples in one of these books was, imagine if you had a stack of books, right, 2 or 3 books, and you put them on your head, right? Now, you wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But now imagine you took a pebble, right, and you put it between that stack of books and your skull. Now all the weight of those books are concentrated in that pebble, and it could be very unpleasant. It could even cause pain, because now you're basically taking the weight, right, or the force, the downward force of those books, and instead of them being spread out over the area of those books, they're now concentrated on the small area of that pebble. And that's what happens with a lot of people, is that they don't have enough of an outlet. The stress is not spread out enough through enough different things that you're doing. Not that you have to to diffuse, another physics term, not that you have to diffuse your energy to finding a whole bunch of different things, but maybe it's also over time. Like, you can spread out the way that you're trying to release your stress. It doesn't just have to be through one particular outlet, which is where it causes that pinpoint of pressure, where it's like you're just trying to get out the pressure through one outlet. The thing is that we all have different things that we already do and different things that we enjoy. And so we can, if we use intention, we can redirect how that stress is being outlet. So like I mentioned my 4 M's before, which are metaphysics, mathematics, music, and martial arts. I intentionally know that when I'm doing these things, these are ways for me to diffuse my stress. And diffusion is a thing that we that's talked about in physics with liquids and gases, right? Where, like for example, if you took a drop of food coloring, you dropped it in water, you could watch that coloring start to spread out into the liquid until after a few hours or days, without it, like if you don't mix it, it will eventually diffuse. The molecules that are in the food coloring and the molecules of the water will eventually dance around each other, and it'll evenly mix out and diffuse and become saturated, or well, actually not saturated, but it'll diffuse, spread out so that there's an even amount of the food coloring in the water over time. Where like as a gas, like if you put ammonia, spilled some ammonia a little bit on one side of a room, those gas molecules, the smell of it will spread out within a few minutes because there's a lot of space between the molecules of the gas, and so it moves much quicker. But you can find different ways to diffuse stress in this way. So there's so many, again, my whole point is that what I find fascinating, that there's so many ways to talk about emotions and behavior in ways that are analogous to physics. And I'm finding that because of this, at my work as a clinical hypnotist is becoming more and more effective because I'm able to connect really solid, real world physical things that have to do with our behavior in this world. Because regardless of whether or not you have a spiritual belief, you have to understand that. So the way that many people look at their spiritual beliefs is that the spirituality is the foundation of everything, and that is true for many people. However, we are experiencing a physical being, a physical life, through through which is the lens that we're perceiving our physical and spiritual world. Sometimes, like our spiritual being seems to be having this physical experience, right? And so there are rules in this physical world that we're in. And it's interesting that when we understand more of these physical material rules, that we can actually get in closer touch with the metaphysical and spiritual truths that we're seeking. Now, this is not definite for everybody all the time, but for me and the way that I apply them, they have been very effective and just also very exciting and very motivating for me, and also have been proven and shown to be very helpful with clients and other people that I work with. And it's just become more and more fascinating as time goes along. And I was talking again earlier. Dr. Sohaib was talking about alcohol addiction, and I had realized how something that he said about how sometimes there are different drugs and medications that can help people with it, but there are also counselors that you can speak to who address the underlying issues. And I found that in my journey, what I had come to realize a while ago was that the reason I was able to completely go straight edge was because my underlying issues were resolved. I wasn't on a very firm foundation of having a purpose and goals and things that I wanted to accomplish, and I was scattered. I wasn't really as focused as I would like to have been. And but when I really locked into that, all of a sudden I couldn't make time for any of those things anymore. And this is also something that's also very related. Mojo, who just I saw went online and has his room going on right now. I've talked to him several times about certain things that he said that keep coming back to me over and over again, is this idea about how we talk about time, right? And in this physical material world, how we talk about time equals money, right? And so, and then you have all these related terms, right? These psychological concepts and mental concepts that are related to that, like time equals money and pay attention, right? And so, if you think about that, when you pay attention, Mojo said something that really uh, catapulted this understanding for me. He says, you could be paying attention to a lot of things, but is that what you want to own? Right. And so I look at that also how, as a clinical hypnotist, I am sharing with people different concepts and different ways of to have options of what they are paying attention to, because you're paying attention with your time. That's what you're paying attention with. Your time is money, currency. And that which you pay attention to is what you are purchasing, and which is what you will own in your life. So what are you paying attention to? Who are you paying attention to, right? And it's actually the foundation of education and life experience in general when we break it all down. And it actually starts to become quite simple, though not easy, but quite simple. And many of these things are related because there are spiritual, emotional, psychological, as well as physical addictions. So a lot of times these things have to be tackled in gradients, gradually, step by step. Dr. Sohaib reminded me earlier about how, of course, everyone can't just completely stop cold turkey like how I did with drinking alcohol and other things. Some people have to do things gradually, right? Like, because there's an example from a movie, a fictional movie that comes from real life, though, the Basketball Diaries with Leonardo DiCaprio. I think Ernie Hudson was the guy in the movie who, saw this kid needed help, and he locked him in a room in his house, and he was going through all these terrible psychological and physical withdrawal symptoms, right? And this is also addressed by the psychiatrist Dr. Peter Breggin in his book Your Drug May Be Your Problem, where he shows that with a lot of these psychiatric medications are very addictive, and that you have to slowly withdraw yourself from them because they can cause serious withdrawal problems up to and including killing you, right? And then, of course, as Dr. John G. Kappas, the founder of the Hypnosis Motivation Institute, where I went to school, had a smoking cessation program, and also talked about in his book, the professional hypnotism manual. But the smoking cessation program talked about gradually reducing the amount of cigarettes that you smoke, week by week. If you're smoking, a pack a day, 20 cigarettes a day, then the next week you only smoke 19 a day, then next week 18. And it's a long process, but it's much better because you gradually reduce it so that your body's not missing it like that. And then there's other things that you do psychologically, hypnotically, in order to help you not want to crave and say, oh, I'm just going to smoke that extra, get back to that 20 again. And then in his hypoglycemic program, where it shows 8 weeks, right, where you can get to the point where you gradually get yourself out of a phobia, which is an irrational fear, whereas a fear is the source of it. And so all of these things are related about this, about the gradual reduction. And again, so many of these things are interrelated, and they provide a lot of structure and background and foundation in which to look at the things that we need and that we find useful for making desired changes in our lives, and finding that there are many ways to do this. There's not just one size fits all, but there are some very interesting ways to approach it that are more efficient than others. And it seems that the things that I have been locking onto are actually, for me and for the people that I work with, been very, very useful in at least the approach that I'm using. And again, there's a saying that says to a hammer, to everything looks like a nail. And one of my favorite specialties, the thing that I focus on a lot, is the subconscious mind. And through the study and the field of and the practice of hypnosis, so I look at so many of these things looking at the laws of self hypnosis, which all hypnosis is self hypnosis. And those laws are repetition and association. You repeat things over and over again, which is practice part, but you also associate it with the emotions and the feelings of success and accomplishment. And you can find those things to tie into by looking at other times in your life that you felt feelings of success and accomplishment. And then you can incubate those things, and you can anchor something to it, like a word or a tug on the ear or different things you can find. And then you can associate those with that practice, that repetition, so that it then becomes more of your second nature or your procedural memory. And I mean, I just really went over a very powerful formula there, but that's really where a lot of this comes from. And it's rooted in physics and science. And I have these amazing connections, which years ago I started calling it psychomatics, but it's really this emotional physics. And now, as I'm saying that, something really interesting comes to mind from after I came back from living in China, and I was on another platform. I don't know if it's still extant, but it was called Breakout. And I was in a room talking, and I had mentioned something about how when I lived in China, when I would go to the ATM, because the currency exchange differences were, for example, going and getting like $150, the equivalent of that to walk around with cash, right, was in the amount of 1,000 yuan, 1,000 Chinese yuan. And when you get that from the ATM, the only thing that the ATM puts out are 100 yuan bills. So so I would go there and I would remove 1,000 kwai, 1,000 yuan, which is, like I said, is at the time could be equal to around, I don't know, 150 bucks, right? So so I got used to, and this is emotional, but this is also related to some sort of physics, right? So I got used to walking around with 10 100 bills, 100 yuan bills. And because of that, all the time I'm used to seeing this 100 all the time, that when I got back to the United States, it did something to me psychologically, where I then found it difficult to function without seeing 100 all the time, like hundreds all the time, like stacks of 100, at least 10, so 1,000. So what went from being $150, now my brain looking at it, because the bills were marked 100, I come over to the United States and I'm like, I have to have 1,000. That, because that's what it was. It was 1,000 yuan, but it translated to $1,000 in my hands. And when I was in this platform called Breakout, a woman who worked for the World, I think, I guess it was World Economic Forum. I forget. It was one of those organizations. It may come to me later, but she says, "Oh, that's actually a thing." She says, "What you're describing about how it became almost an obsession, an addiction, because you were used to seeing that, and when you came back to the United States, it translated into you having to have 10 bills that were marked 100." She said that's something we call part of a study that's been known called economic physics. I said, really? Economic physics? I had no idea that something like that existed. Maybe I might have a little bit, because years ago I had read a book called Babylon's Banksters by Joseph P. Farrell, and I actually did a whole series of readings on it on my podcast. I read the whole book on there, and it's really interesting. Babylon's Banksters. It was like deep physics, high finance, deep physics, or something like that. Oh, it's the alchemy of high finance and deep physics, or something like that. Really great book, very interesting. Borderlining conspiracy theory stuff, but a fascinating read nonetheless. But again, all this I'm saying is to demonstrate that there are definitely so many interrelated uh, interrelated points with, and I'm specifically talking about emotions and human behavior and the way that we can understand things through science and physics, and that by mining that we can find some very precise ways to alter our behavior and therefore achieve the results that we desire by using these very precise techniques. Again, it's not one size fits all. It's just that they have been proving over time to be more effective as time goes along. And anybody who has uh, heard me speaking and met me on this platform before Wisdom merged with Noom, and on this platform became Noom Vibe, will tell you that even in recent history, the way that I'm presenting, the way that I'm speaking, the way that I sound even is drastically different in a lot of ways from when I first started here. And that was just about 2 years ago. Because one of those things that I've managed to hold on to is being consistent, is I have persisted and I didn't give up. And I've documented all of this stuff. I have websites that have been online since 2006, and you can see the chaotic psychological frenzy and the struggle that was in my brain and mind that has been put out and published and put on these websites, and has shown that, at, if nothing else, I have kept on going. And that is incredible, because back to that Newton's first law of motion, an object at rest and an object in motion. will stay as they are unless they're acted upon by an outside force. And so the one thing that can be said of all of us is that we're all in motion. It's just that, or we're all at rest, right? Because Einstein came along and showed that this is all relative, right? Because if you're on a bus or in your car and you're going at a constant speed, like if you have your cruise control on, it is completely correct to say that you're at rest because you're at a constant velocity. And it's also completely correct for a person watching you drive by them to say that you're in motion. And that person, it is completely correct for them to say that they are at rest, standing there watching you drive by. And it is also completely correct, according to physics, for you to say that that person is in motion relative to you. That's relativity. That's part of the theory of relativity. And experiments and different things show that this is true even deeper when it comes to the velocity of light and how clocks change and everything like that, which I don't need to get into now. But it's pretty amazing. But the point is that we all can be said to be at rest and or in motion, right? But but there's inertia involved. And the point is that if you are not at resting in the desired place or in motion in a desired trajectory, a desired direction that you want to go, then you know that you need to apply an appropriate amount of an outside force to overcome that inertia. And that outside force is motivation. Part of it is motivation. And again, it's related to the school that I went to, which is called the Hypnosis Motivation Institute. And that is the thing right there, is to understand and to learn that it's about the appropriate amount of motivation combined with behavioral action. And those things right there will overcome the inertia that we are feeling stuck. And then understanding a few things about kinematics, or this, as I'm calling it, psychematics, right? Whereas if we're in that rat race, to understand that, yes, the rat race is one thing. It's a trap. It's where you might be traveling miles or kilometers, but you're traveling those miles and kilometers in a circle, or you're just going east, north, west, and south an equal distance each time and ending back up in the same place all the time. So you're going a distance, a scalar, an amount, but there's no vector. There's no displacement from where you are. And again, on and on. So many of these things are related, but it's once you can start to get those things into understanding and focus and realize that there is something that can be done about it. And it's not just one thing, but they are simple things, which again, simple doesn't mean easy. That's an illusion sometimes, that some things are simple. Some people think that simple means easy, but it doesn't, because it is simple to not hit your snooze button every morning when you have to wake up, right? But it's not easy for many people, especially when it's also simple to just go to sleep uh, and lay down to give yourself an adequate amount of time to get enough rest to do. But it's not easy, or else everybody would be doing it. One of the biggest issues that people face in this world is chronic sleep deprivation. Most people don't realize that, as well as chronic dehydration and so many things. It's simple to sleep enough. It's simple to drink enough water, but it's not easy in the way that the world's operating, the structure of our society, or else everybody would be doing it all the time when we wouldn't have the issues that we're having. But the but here's something that may be illuminating to understand here, is that meanwhile many of these things are simple and not easy, it becomes easier when you know what these simple things are or how to address them. And that's the point. That's one of the points, is that yes, these things may be simple, but you may not understand it in the way that helps you to apply it and then gradually build up to building strength in that, just like going to the gym, just like anything else, right? Like overcoming so many obstacles in life. I often relate a lot of things. See, I'm full of analogies, which are types of association. And one of them is being also a personal fitness trainer and a self-defense instructor, as well as a master hypnotist or clinical hypnotherapist, right, is teaching people fitness. You can relate many things in your life as you're kind of weak to these things, and you have to work your way up to it. It's like going to the gym and lifting up a 100-pound dumbbell. At first, it seems difficult, right? But if you lift it consistently and with the right technique, right, in the right way, eventually it feels easier. But it's not that it is easier. You are becoming stronger in relation to that gravitational force and the mass of that object, right? You are now becoming more efficient at moving that weight. That's what happens. And so many of these things, again, I will be talking about these same things. Efficiency is one of them, right? And these analogous relationships between the physical sciences and emotions and behavior. There's so many amazing relationships to be found in them, but it's about first understanding the simplicity of it and then little by little applying them until you get stronger using them so that the things that you're facing feel easier to you. See, one of the reasons why things feel difficult at first is because you haven't built up the strength. It feels difficult. It feels so heavy. The weight of the world is on your shoulders, right? Because you have not moved that weight around of whatever it is. It could be grief. It could be um, not understanding something. It could be emotions of some kind, all kind of things. But once you learn how to exercise with those things, that's why I call one of my concepts is called hypnoathletics, exercising your mind. Once you exercise with it in the right way and consistently, you get stronger, and now you can move the weight of these obstacles more efficiently, and it feels easier to you. So you go about your life moving these things out of the way with greater ease than you did before. But it's not really that it's greater ease. It's just you're doing it more efficiently because you become stronger. That is the root of all of this, is becoming stronger. And strength is not just physical. It could be said that there's spiritual, emotional, mental, as well as and psychological as well as physical strength, right? So it's all of those things. And there are similar ways through repetition and association, which are the cornerstones of self-hypnosis, and all hypnosis is self-hypnosis, and how to apply these things. Simple, right? Those two things, repetition and association, but not easy because they require a consistent application over time. And that's how we get things done. The clock and the ruler, right? Measurement. And we can do anything with those. And now, as I'm going to close out here, I'm going to geek out just a little bit just because I want to put in a recording so I can listen to this later for my notes as I continue to refine these ideas. It reminds me of some ancient schools of thought, one called the trivium and one called the quadrivium, because I just mentioned space and time. And space-time in science is best approached with a clock and a ruler. And in the equation for acceleration or speed, as everybody knows it, right? Which people in the United States know it as miles per hour. That's space-time right there. How many miles you go in an hour? You know, the most common mileage that we think about is 60 miles an hour. That's like one of the average highway speeds, right? Which basically says that you'll go 60 miles. Ruler, that's the length, in 1 hour time. That's the basic equation of space-time right there. Is how many units of distance per units of time, miles per hour. That is space-time in a nutshell right there. And but back to this trivium, these ancient systems of thought, trivium and quadrivium. It reminds me when I talked about space-time there, that the trivium are these three basic subjects, which are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And you learn the rules of grammar, and you learn logic, the ways to think about it, and then rhetoric, you discuss it, right? Rhetorical, you start using the grammar and logic in discussions. And it could be said that if you look at a triangle with the point pointing upward, that grammar is on the left point of the triangle towards the bottom. Logic is at the top point, at the apex, and rhetoric is at the right side, the right point. But then you can, that at the point where there's logic, right, there's now something called the quadrivium. You can imagine it as a square or a diamond, however you wish. But either the flat side, let's just say that the diamond is balancing on that triangle, right? And I just was thinking about this the other day because the word logic is at the point there. But the bottom of the diamond, right, which is basically a square just resting on one of its points or one of its corners, right? So where logic in that bottom triangle, right, because you got grammar, logic is at the top point, and rhetoric is at the right point, right? But logic is most related to what's at the bottom point of the quadrivium, which is number, because logic, number is actually probably the first writing systems came from counting, but mathematics deals with logic, right? The way that we think about things logically. And so, but at the bottom point of this quadrivium, the higher subjects is number. And if you look over at the left point of this diamond, you'll see geometry, which is number in space. And if you look over at the right point of this diamond, is number in time, which is music. Music is number in time. And at the top point of the diamond, you have astronomy, which is, guess what? Number in space and time. It's amazing how even some of those ancient thoughts, those older thoughts, you can use in their simplicity, still make certain sense today, at least from my point of view. Again, I definitely am not a person who stays on any side of any kind of fences at all. So I teeter totter back and forth. I'm in the playground of both physics and metaphysics. I'm as much uh, Harry Potter as I am, quantum mechanics. So it's an interesting field to play on where there are no lines for me. They blur into each other, but it's at the point now where I am fully understanding the boundaries between the two. And that is the thesis for my doctorate degree that I've hijacked, which I find fascinating as well, how some things work out serendipitously. With my dual doctorate, one is called a Doctor of Divinity, which is more like a spiritual or religious degree, something that, for example, like Michael Bernard Beckwith would have, who runs the spiritual center in California called Agape, or even what Dr. Martin Luther King had. I'm not comparing myself to them. I'm just using these as examples of what a Doctor of Divinity is. Either you've done a great spiritual work in something, and a church or a religious organization honorarily awards that to you, or you go through training in school, which I had in order to get the degree Doctor of Divinity. But the one that fascinates me the most that serendipitously happened is in my PhD in metaphysical sciences. And what I found, because of the fact that I tread in the oceans and seas of both physics and metaphysics, is that the word meta, because I love acronyms, I was able to look at it and make my thesis become something completely different than the school ever thought their students would probably focus on to write a paper on. But meta is a Greek word that means above or beyond. So metaphysics is above or beyond physics, right? So uh, you, anything that's spiritual and psychological and emotional, all those things that are not described in physics and in the natural sciences. But to me, I found that meta, META, was a perfect acronym for four major branches of physics. META, mathematical, experimental, theoretical, and applied physics. And this is what my thesis on, what my doctorate is awarded for, and so and centers on what I've been talking about here, this idea of psychematics, which sometimes I call emotional physics. But it's showing how, by going into the very physical laws and physical theories of the universe that scientists through the ages have come across, and experiment has shown to be relevant to our reality, and how they become relevant not only to math, experiment, theory, and application, but also to the application to how we can change our perspective, alter our belief systems, and therefore our behavior and the results that we achieve. And this is a fascinating journey for me. And I'm going to continue honing and refining and putting this together, but it is a wonderful trip. So, emotional physics, my psychematics, this is a great merging, mixing, and melding of physics and metaphysics that I have found to be so useful to me in my practice as a clinical hypnotist and as an instructor. Like I say, with hypnoathletics, is exercising our minds towards universal harmony and spiritual wisdom through healthy living and self-defense. There I shall end and return some other time. Who knows? Like I like to say sometimes, I'm the hitman, Hitman, Hakeem, in the morning, afternoon, and night, because I never know when I'm going to be around here in the morning, afternoon, or night. Until next time, stay well.